Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, everyone. Yes, I'm saying all three because I don't know where you're watching from or what time you're watching. So I really want to welcome you to Live Well Sister with your girl, me, Marcie L. Thomas. So as you come in the room, feel free to drop a note to let us know whether it's your first time here or if you've been here many times and you just want to shout out your location. I am originally from Cleveland, Ohio, coming to you from the outskirts of Atlanta, Georgia, my current home. So I really love having opportunities to be in this space and bring to you wonderful women who are powerhouses in their fields of endeavor. And tonight is no exception. So tonight we are going to be talking about some stuff, and I'm being honest with you, it's kind of deep because I read the book, and as I've already told our guest, I'm going to have to go back through because I need to actually do the work that she encourages to do in the book. So we're going to be talking about Break the Cycle, a guide to healing intergenerational trauma. So our special guest for the evening is Dr. Mariel Buqué, who is an Afro-Latina psychologist and CEO of Break the Cycle of Trauma, where her mission is to help reduce the recurrence of intergenerational ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. She earned her doctoral degree in psychology at Columbia University, where she also trained as a holistic mental health fellow at Columbia University Irving Medical Center. In this role, she helped to build and implement an integrated system of care in specialty clinics across the hospital system with a focus on helping Black and Latin community members overcome trauma and build better overall health. She continues to carry this mission into her consultation with health organizations and Fortune 500 companies. Originally from the Dominican Republic, she currently lives in the great state of New Jersey. So without any further delay, let's welcome Dr. Mariel Buqué to Live Well Sister. Welcome.
Thank you, Marcie. What a beautiful welcome. I'm so excited to join you.
Yes, I'm so excited to have you here because as I told you, as you were coming into the space that the book really resonated with me. It's an important piece of work, and I really hope that people embrace it for what it is and dive in and actually do the hard work. So thank you for this.
Thank you. Thank you for appreciating it and spotlighting Break the Cycle in such a beautiful way. I'm so excited to dive in and curious for your questions.
Yes. So I guess my first question is, what is it that made you want to even go into this area of work? Because there are a lot of different ways you could have gone in your career, but I want to know a little bit about what drew you to go into trauma work.
Yeah, it's so interesting because lately I've actually been adding my answer to this question to a couple of the talks that I've been giving because I get this question so often. And the funny thing about how the question is asked, you ask it in a very gentle, neutral way. But sometimes I get the question in a way like, trauma really? Are you sure that's one you want to talk about every single day?
Okay.
Are you okay? Because that's a lot. It's heavy. It's grief-stricken, right? There's a lot of work there. And what I have landed at really is that I believe that this work really found me. I've always been especially as a kid, I was the type of kid that would soak up everybody's emotions. And I would be around a lot of pain. I'm not just from the Dominican Republic. And also, Black identified as a Black woman, I definitely, see a lot of the pain in the Black community and the Black diaspora, but also as an immigrant to the U.S., and also, living in an economically impoverished community, which is Newark, New Jersey, where I'm from. A lot of the culmination of all those things made it so that I was very exposed to pain, very exposed to trauma, very exposed not just to my own and my family's trauma, but everybody around me had something. And not just that, but we also bared witness to a lot of stuff. A lot of stuff, gun violence, incarceration of our community members and people that we cared about, like just stuff that's like, whoa. So I feel like the work eventually said, this is where you need to be. We need you here. But then I added an additional thought that really came to mind more so in the recent years. I started putting out Break the Cycle, and I was like, really sitting with the fact that I don't have the luxury of not working with trauma. Us as people, we continue to suffer more greatly, right? And also we continue to be held in therapy sessions or in healing sessions with practitioners who don't understand us, who re-traumatize us, who make it so that our lives feel overburdened, not just by the fact that there's a lot of burdens on us by way of our intersecting identities, but also there's a lot of burdens on us by way of entering healing spaces that then create added wounds. And I was like, I literally don't have the luxury of tiring of talking about trauma and really getting into this work in a very intentional way because my people are hurting. So this is, I feel like it's such an honor to be able to do trauma work. And I'm so grateful that I get to live in my purpose with this work and with this book.
Absolutely, because you're right. It is tough. It's not easy, but the name of this show is Live Well. And let's just, keep it a buck here. If you're going to live well, living well doesn't come easy. Whether it's, all those things that, show at the intro, whether it's your finances or your spiritual life or, your relationships, your personal relationship with yourself, your career, none of that is easy. And it does require a certain level of work and a certain level of willingness to be vulnerable and do said work. So that's why books like yours are so important, because it encourages us to do that hard work. So that we can get to that space of feeling healed or living well, or as you may have it.
Yeah. And I know we are throwing out in terms of living well. The idea of the soft life has really cemented itself in the vocabulary of a lot of, our community members. And this idea of soft life, this idea of stepping into our soft era, I see it as an idea that isn't driven by the elaborate vacations that we can take and then come back to the pain once we reach home. That's not soft. That's avoidance. For me, what I feel is soft is the digging into our wounds, excavating the roots of the wounds, and feeling lighter within ourselves so that wherever we land on this planet, we can go to Bali. But the Bali that we get to experience is a Bali that is centered on the lightness that we experience within. Wow. Yeah. So for me, it's really about, engaging in living well in the soft life from the perspective of you being well, right? Us being well, really sustainably being well. And because we have a world that constantly reminds us down to this very minute of how little worth it applies to our lived experiences and to our personhood, it's all the more important that we excavate and that we do the digging work in order to actually feel lighter, to also balance out how much of the world continues to pummel us.
That is so true. That's true. Thank you for that. Now, intergenerational is another thing, because oftentimes when we think of trauma, we might think of what happened to us personally. But intergenerational is a whole nother level to it. And actually, there's a chapter in the book. There are layers or levels to it. So what is it that, leaning in about the intergenerational aspect of it that you feel is so important for us to work through?
Well, much of the trauma that we do have doesn't have a beginning and end in our generation. It doesn't. It's trauma that, particularly for us that are living in Black and Brown experiences, that we have wounds that go far beyond when we were born. And when I started learning that, and I started learning how little even us as clinicians knew about this very way in which our clients show up to the therapy sessions with us, they show up with these layered wounds, and yet we don't have any concrete tools and techniques to be able to help them through that. I thought that's a disservice. We're doing a disservice to our community members, bringing them in and checking off depression, PTSD, and not really knowing how to navigate them out of the depression and PTSD. So
Mm,
managing symptoms around what we feel like, okay, this person suffered, but we're not really taking into account the element of intergenerational trauma that makes it intergenerational in part, which is the fact that there is a biological component. There's a way in which, from generation to generation, genetic expressions do get passed down that indicate there's been a lot of suffering here. And if we are going to be working with any person that is particularly Black, because I think that there is a very distinctive experience that people that were illegally transported to the Americas,
right.
and then subsequently subjugated for generations, there is a very unique experience that is held in the bodies of Black folks that is really, really important for us to identify as not beginning in one generation. And there is clear-cut evidence, right? Like we in this society, we talk about racism, we talk about caste systems, but we not as often are talking about, well, what are the emotional repercussions of having been someone that has had to undergo the experience, the lived experience of a perpetual caste system that is unrelentless and is still not giving up. It's not
Mm,
giving up, we're still in it.
right.
And so for me, when I encounter someone that it gives me the immense honor of being able to be their therapist, I look at them, and as soon as they're either Black identified by identifying that way with me, or I can visibly see this person is living in Black skin or
Hmm.
Black features, and I understand that the way that they have to navigate the world has been driven by those features, but also that there is a likely chance that people in their family line have suffered deeply, I have to change my perspective and I have to change my tools. I can't necessarily like come in and say, this is just like that last person that came in that is visibly presenting as white and has a completely different experience than this person. I'm treating both people from the same perspective with the same methodology and the same tools. It doesn't work, right? We continue to feel hurt. We have a mental health crisis that is disproportionately affecting our people. And there's a reason for that. It's because we are living in bodies and minds and in spirits that have been pummeled for generations. So for me, it was a kind of a no-brainer. Like the lens must be generational, and then the tools must be generational.
Yes, yes, and there are such great tools. As you can see at the bottom, all of Dr. Bouquet's information is scrolling. But specifically, if you go to the website, there are some resources there, some journal prompts and things like that that you can dive into, even if you haven't had a chance to read the book yet. Is the key word yet. I believe everybody should read that. But another thing that I really could appreciate about Break the Cycle is, yes, you were talking, from the perspective, of the things that you learned of, the studies and the research and all of that, some things from your own experience with patients. But then you also had a personal element. And that I thought that was great to bring it home and to kind of see how these things have even impacted you.
Yeah, yeah. Some of it was a little bit of a shocker as I was doing the work, and I was like, "Oh snap, that's me too."
Like, oops.
Humbling moment where I'm like, I feel the same. I remember distinctly, like I had been in a few sessions with some of my, especially initial clients, where I was like almost kind of choking in my own anxiety because I
Mm,
like, oh my goodness, like what they're describing is exactly what has happened in my family. What they're talking about is exactly some of the things that I have felt in my own lifetime. And it was a humbling moment where I was like, oh, I have to do work too. And if I have to do work, I have to be very authentic and genuine in my expression of my own journey, which is why I added it in the book. When us therapists, like, we're trained, the ones that are trained really well, we're trained to ensure that that the stories that we use that are personal stories always have clinical utility. Meaning that if I'm in session with someone and I'm like, yeah, girl, that happened to me too, it's not for me that I'm
Right.
saying that. It's so that the person can feel, you know what? That's a destigmatizing statement. That's actually a statement that helps me feel more human. That's something that helps me to feel like this is a person that gets me. They get the experience. And that's what I was hoping would come through in the book, that I could say, I've been in pain. It has taken me some time to work through it. I've had to be the black sheep in my family. I'm no longer that person. Thankfully, like, they've come around after years, right? Like, we have to put it in perspective. But there's been work that I was very committed to doing with my family. There was work that I was very committed to doing within myself because I was not settled. I didn't feel good. And I wanted that softness, a real softness. So I needed to put that in for the basis of, like, the clinical utility of helping people to feel the destigmatization, but also because I wanted us to share our humanity within the book.
Absolutely, and that's good, because you mentioned some lemongrass tea that, I'm a tea lover, so I'm like, okay, this is something that's been passed down, through your family lineage. That is something that provides comfort to you. So I loved being able to see that. But for those who might be wondering, well, what the heck is intergenerational trauma? Name maybe one or two ways how that might show up in a person so they can say, oh, okay, now I understand what that even means.
Yes, yes. Intergenerational trauma is actually the only type of trauma that's handed down our family line. And it happens like if we have a parent, grandparent, great grandparents, ancestors who have themselves suffered for a prolonged period of time. If they had experiences around trauma, it's likely that those experiences could have shown up in their genetic encoding. And then when they conceived, our parents, then us, right? That genetic encoding, that the messaging in our genes, like, gets transferred forward. What that means is that it could create, like, an added vulnerability to stress and trauma. So for example, like me, if somebody, like, pokes at me, I would be more tender than someone who doesn't have a generational trauma history within their family line. And so, when we start looking at our own lives and start thinking, well, what does it actually look like? Think about this, right? We have family members who they may be short fused, and they're like constantly lashing out at someone or something for whatever reason. And we chalk it up to, that's just how she is. Well, is that how she is? Or is that not just the tenderness of that emotional vulnerability that's biologically enshrined in her? But in addition to that, is that also the fact that she grew up learning that when you're stressed, you yell. That's a learned response. It's generational also. And that she never learned otherwise. So basically, her nervous system started structuring itself around yelling whenever there's stress. So are we really looking at someone that is indeed like just personality short fused? Or are we looking at somebody that's actually hurting? And the same goes for other things that are like patterns, right? Especially relationship patterns that we tend to see in our family line. And one that is, I think, one of the most common ones is, for example, codependency. Codependency is a kind of relationship dynamic where we basically kind of like over rely on other people to come help soothe our emotions. And when we start looking down our family line, we can see, oh, would you look at that? Dad never could really tolerate his own emotions. And mom or, whomever was like partnered with dad would come in and do everything that was in her power to make sure that he was okay because he didn't know how to self-soothe. And that is one of the methodologies of like codependency. I don't know how to self-soothe, so everybody has to come and rescue me. And so now you grow up being a kid, you're absorbing that when I'm feeling anxious, when I'm feeling sad, I need somebody to come save me. And now in your relationships, now you're in adult amorous relationships, and you're like,
Mhm.
throwing your hands up, come save me, someone. So is it really that, you just develop codependency out of thin air, or were you observant to the very dynamics that were present in your family home, maybe even in your community, church members, whomever, that actually modeled these kinds of relationship dynamics that then get inherited generation after generation, because people don't know, hey, there's another way of being, there's another way of like engaging in relationships that's healthier, that's not codependent.
Wow, and that's powerful. And, in reading the book, there are a lot of other examples, but those are two great ones just to kind of help us see, how that manifests. I know, and like you said, sometimes in behaviors, because we might think of the person who, maybe the person who develops, alcoholism,
Yes.
because that's how they always saw somebody cope, by drinking, or, other things like that. So it can be a multitude of ways in which it shows up. And I know a lot of times people in a religious space may call it, a generational curse, but it's deeper than that.
Yeah. I mean, the thing about a generational curse and that idea and that terminology, is that it kind of decreases our agency, right? Like it takes away our ability to see that we can surpass this, we can be above it. Generational curses, when I think of it, I think, oh my goodness, it's on me, so that's it, it's a wrap. There's nothing I can do. It's a curse, it's passed down. But when we think about it as generational strain, emotional strain, generational trauma, right? Like it allows us an opportunity to say, actually, this is an emotional process that hasn't been addressed. And I think that that's the beautiful thing of like, and some of what I wanted to highlight in this book, that it's not just doom and gloom. It's not just that we may have inherited certain ways in which our genes had expressed. It's also that we can actually help our genes to re-express differently in this generation. It's also that our brains are neuroplastic and have the capacity to actually form differently, like grow new neural connections that actually are connected to our experiences of calm and ease. It's that our nervous systems don't have to be stuck in the very same places. It's all of that. There's change also that can happen.
And I love that because, and I have certain people in my life that, and, you talk about this a little later in the book about things that happen in childhood. Because the first thing when people start talking about therapy, they're like, sometimes family members or whatever, like, oh my God, they're gonna tell you that I was a terrible parent. Like, no, not necessarily. I mean, there are things that happen, in childhood that tend to carry over into our adult lives. Because I mean, that's just natural. But I think of the thing where sometimes people have experienced a thing and then they're not able to move beyond that thing because they have not taken the time to like go through a process of learning and figuring out that just because something excuse me was a certain way doesn't mean that it always has to be that way.
Yes, indeed. I love that reframe. And it's so important because it's more empowering, right? Like, when we can think of the fact that we have agency and power within us to actually make a change that's really tangible. And for anybody who's a parent, right? Like, or even people that are non-parents and just have people that are young people around them that get to witness them, those young people get to witness a different version of you that's breaking cycles. And that's a beautiful thing. I'm a perpetual auntie. I have so many nieces, nephews, godchildren. Like, I'm not a parent myself, although I helped to co-parent my nephew and he's now 16. But, I haven't birthed a child, but I've been so fortunate to have a number of different kids in my life. And the ways that I am showing up in reference to myself and in reference to my mission to be a cycle breaker is something that they're bearing witness to. And I don't take that lightly because they are actually experiencing a different kind of modeling than what I saw growing up. And what I saw growing up was a type of modeling behavior that I kind of, at times, I sit with my parents and I feel a bit of compassion for them because unfortunately for them, they never had a break the cycle. They never had tools. They never had anyone say, hey, that's generational trauma. They never had anyone process grief with them. And I think that's such a, such a disservice that we've done to society. Of course, generational trauma is fairly new as a concept, so I understand that that's also a thing. But what I hope in this work is that we can also reach back and we can say, you know what, even if it's a tiny microscopic change that you might be able to do by way of knowing that there is a different way, I'd like for you to have at least agency and the ability to know that there's a different way. Because many of the older generations have grown up not knowing that anything else can be possible for them. And also, my parents, for example, some of the things that they've done differently in the last decade has allowed my nephew, who's now 2 generations removed, to bear witness to older folks who are now in, late 60s, 70s, to now feel he can feel them in a more settled way.
Right.
The beauty of that multi-generational gift to me is like, I love seeing it in my family because then I can reflect it. Because of course I see it in my clinical work, and that's different. Like I'm immensely proud of the people I get to work with, but to actually see that in my family and then say, hey, I've seen it on both sides, the personal and the professional, is like, to me, it always makes me beam.
Yes, that's so beautiful. I want to talk about the mind-body connection because, of course, we know that exists. I guess intellectually, but in the day-to-day realness of it, I don't think we always understand how much there is a connection between what's happening, whether it's that trauma that's passing down through generations or certain stressors that you're dealing with in the world, and how those things show up in the body.
Yeah. And there's a multitude of ways in which it shows up in the short term, but also in the long term. And I think that, maybe us highlighting a couple of key examples of how it shows up can be helpful, because I find that sometimes even when I'm like talking to folks, I'm like, who here, like, has tension headaches, right? Like, and
Mhm.
people raise their hand and I'm like, yeah, right? Like, let's talk about that. We're talking about emotional tension. You have a dilemma. That dilemma is not finding resolution quickly enough. So you're like in the tension. What happens when you're feeling tense? Your brain is actually like feeling like it's overworking. It's developing a lot of tension points and you get a headache. What happens when you're navigating through your work environment and you experience a microaggression here, somebody didn't turn in their report here, and that's going to make you look bad to the, upper management. All of a sudden you've got a host of things that are happening. What's happening to your neck muscles are tensing up.
Mm.
What's happening now when you reach that lunch hour and now it's time to eat? You're like, I'm not even hungry. It's probably because your nervous system is constricting your gastrointestinal tract because it's entirely too stressed and it's in survival mode until you get that report in and you can actually save face, right? And so when we start looking at our day and we start looking at the ways in which our mind is mechanizing whatever it is that's happening in our day, and our entire body in different ways is responding to that, we start to really see in a tangible way the two are interconnected. It's not that we take our mind and we like put it on a chair next to us, right? Like, mind is literally interconnected in millions of ways into our body. It's like one whole system. So it makes a lot of sense that that report gave you a tension headache, or that you couldn't necessarily digest your food in a way that felt nourishing, and you only took 2 bites because you couldn't even like really take in anymore. It all makes sense when we start looking at it that way. And it makes a lot of sense also for the healing to look at it that way. When, someone is in front of me and they're telling me a story and they're gripping their stomach, I want to know, what are you feeling there? I want to know how can I help you to help yourself in this moment so that you can also feel a relief in your stomach area and your nervous system can actually rest and digest, is what we call the nervous system that is able to feel calm. It has the ability to rest and has the ability to digest. So if we want to shift you into rest and digest, we have to understand, what about what you're saying right now, or what about your life right now is creating the constriction in your stomach.
Wow. Yeah, that's because when you said the whole thing about tension in the shoulders, like, ooh, you talking about me? 'Cause every time I go to get a massage, the young lady's like, "Ma'am, Miss Ma'am."
Like you need an extra half hour just to get that.
Yeah, it's like
Yeah.
next time you come, you need more time, and you need to do this. The last time I went, the girl's like, "You need to make sure you take some Epsom salt baths because yeah, I carry it like right up in here. It's always up in here, you know." So I get that for
Yeah.
sure. But one of the things that really kind of stood out to me in the book is talking about grief in the lungs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was like something that to me was very eye-opening. Now, the thing about grief being in the lungs, and I know that you know, but I explained in the book that there was both a client that I had worked with who had actually had like a downward decline that was in her lungs. She had a fibrosis in her lungs and inflammation in her lungs, and the doctors weren't really able to identify where is this even coming from, like what's happening here. And simultaneously, I was also having the experience of my sister having a decline in her health related to her lungs. Who had previously not just suffered, you know, a grief in her life, but had also been somebody who had been pervasively parentified. My mother just, you know, she had to work 2 jobs. She needed her eldest daughter to step in and care for me. And unfortunately, it robbed my sister of her childhood. And it happens to a lot of eldest daughters, right? You're made to be an adult earlier than what you ought to be. And what that leaves a child with is the grief of a lost childhood. And so when we're talking about grief, we're talking about the full spectrum of grief: losing a person, losing a job, losing a childhood, losing a pet, losing, right? Like the loss. What I started seeing is that, wow, there's these connections, like people that, you know, are experiencing losses that impact them greatly are also having complications in their lungs. And there's this book that I started studying that had this interconnectedness between like the mind and body, but from the perspective of Eastern medicine, meaning like Chinese medicine and the ways in which we have certain places in our bodies that carry a specific set of emotions. And I learned through Chinese medicine that grief is actually captured in the lungs more than in any other part of our bodies. And I started, you know, like digging through that, and the reason why I highlight the fact that there is indigenous and ancestral practices and understandings that are really important for us to hold on to is because you have thousands of years of Chinese medicine, thousands of years of, you know, African derived like wisdom, thousands of years of native folks like having an understanding of the body and its interconnectedness to earth. And you have all of this that is negated by the current medical model. They're not really attending to it, but there's so much wisdom there that we can actually carry into our healing that's being discarded because it's not Western Eurocentric philosophies around healing. And so I started attending to these mechanisms of healing and these ideas of emotions captured in the body, and it helped me to understand more concretely how the loss that my sister experienced of a lost childhood, but also the losses that I was seeing of clients in my therapy room, how these were connected. These were experiences that were losses that then led to physical complications that were chronic, and more specifically chronic in the lungs.
Question: how is this connected with proper breathing?
Yes. I mean, gosh, I wish I had like a diagram of how breathing infiltrates the body and how it calms the mind, right? But we also have to think about, I mean, I think there's some studies that have been done also around constricted breathing and lung complications and what feels like asthma, but in reality is a constriction that's happening because of the emotions that are there. And so all of that is definitely, you know, a part of what I think it's important for us to add that lens to our understanding, because like we could be looking at a kid who's 12 years old. It might be our child, it might be someone else's. And that kid is having, you know, an asthma attack and they're like not able to breathe. And there is at the very least, we have to maybe just consider that we might be dealing with just a straight up asthma attack, or we might be dealing with an actual panic attack that has,
Mm,
right, that's driven by something that's happening in this little person's life that is looking like breath constriction. And so my hope is that we can, at the very least, get curious. And if we have
mhm.
a child at home, yes, we have the pump, right? We can get them to calm down. But what about the long term? What can
Right.
we help them to do with their emotions long term so they could have less of these occurrences and maybe even, kind of step out of that asthma diagnosis? But with regards to this beautiful question, the connection is very deep. Breath is actually, and deep breathing is one of the most effective tools that we have to calm both the mind and the body. And the
Yes.
beautiful thing about deep breathing, especially if it's done for at least 5 minutes, is that we have an opportunity to do any kind of deep breathing if we are alive. What I mean
Mm,
by that is, there, for some of us, we have mobility challenges, right? For some of us, we may we may have age differences and what we can do. Like if I tell someone, hey, you should probably do some trauma informed yoga, great. But if you're someone who's like my mother, who's in her mid 70s, it probably won't be something that you'll be
right.
able to do with consistency. It's not a very fair ask. But she can deep breathe because she's alive and she has the breath. And
Yes.
so deep breathing is one of the ways in which our minds immediately and our bodies start to feel relaxed. But the added, what this is like the best part of it, which really makes my soul really happy to continue talking about deep breathing within our communities, is that it actually has a way in which it can change our bodies. It
Mm,
actually has a way in which it can do some of that reversal of the intergenerational strain that's there. And that's the beautiful part of it, that it's not just like take a deep breath and calm down. No, it's take a deep breath so that you can ease your mind and body, but also so that your mind and body can start reprogramming itself to health rather than to pain.
I love that. I love that because we are, of course, breaking the cycle. It's about breaking the cycle. Thank you
Mhm.
for that question, Jean. What I also love, and you mentioned about the whole thing of you use utilizing different modalities, and you talk about that in the book. It's a holistic plan that's
Mhm.
going to get us to where we need to be. So it is, the mind, the body, the spirit, the soul, all of those things. And incorporating other things like we've already mentioned, like you like to drink the tea. Certain teas have healing properties within them. You also
Mhm.
talk about sound baths, and you have some that people can access. I love a good sound bath. People are like, what is that? Like, you just need to try it. I love sound bath. But
Yep.
so things like that aren't always, it's not always taking a pill. Because folks are quick to say, take this pill, take this medication to deal with whatever it is, whether it's a mental health thing or whether it's a physical health thing. But then there are these other healing modalities that can help us, you
Mhm.
know, to bring about change in our lives.
And it helps us to, I love that you're referencing this as bringing about change in our lives. The framing is beautiful and it's what I was hoping for. And I also, I think that the more that we're able to know about these healing properties of other things, the more that we have a capacity to really know ourselves better and know what can help us. Like, I've been lately struggling with a bit of exhaustion, and I think whenever I'm exhausted, I can already tell within myself there is a chance that I might actually respond with a different tone than what I intend. It's just going to be like a little bit on edge, like, and it's like that's not what I meant, right? Like, and it's like it's not, it doesn't coincide with my values and the ways that I want to show up. So I know that about myself, like exhaustion, I'm like on edge. And I realized just today, I'm like, why am I so exhausted? But beyond daylight savings, obviously, it's like really
Right.
throwing me off. But I was like, oh, hydration. And also
Mm.
I've been detoxing a lot with detox teas and like really kind of like trying to get my body to purge a little bit. But I have been forgetting, and that's why I have green tea today. Like I also need to replenish. Whatever
Right.
I'm detoxing, that's releasing. But what about the antioxidants that my brain and body need to feel like they're in the best health? What about the anti-inflammatory properties of green tea? Because if we're talking about stress and we're talking about depression, both of those are inflammatory emotional processes. So if we're integrating green tea, for example, I'm not saying that people need to do this. So I want to disclaimer that, right? But this is my method just based on what I
Right.
know. It's important that I start integrating anti-inflammatory substances into my system, like green tea. And I took a jug of coconut water so that I can hydrate and I can feel more settled. And it was fascinating because I instantly felt better. And I'm like, oh,
Mhm.
look at that. I was missing the nourishment that is body based, but then my mind became more settled and I didn't have that edge. And so that's the kind of like thinking that I'm hoping we can gravitate towards when it comes to our mental health, that we can start looking at ourselves as a holistic human that needs holistic ways to take care of ourselves.
Yes, that ways to ground yourself. So many things that you
Mhm.
talk about in the book because you do offer opportunities for us to ask ourselves questions and learn new methods, tools for your tool belt. It's so funny that you said that because I've told my mom that recently. It's like I'm working on getting some good tools in my tool belt, for whatever different situations are, so that I have something that I can grab a hold of when I'm dealing with stress or whatever it is that I might be dealing with, to have some things to revert to. So I love that that's something that you provide. Now, we didn't talk, but the book's broken down into three sections. One is the things that you inherited, which are oftentimes those things just that, whether it's through DNA or, those memories that are coming through your family line, but the fact that there are also different layers to it, but whether it is collective trauma, which you've talked about a little bit, or the things that are happening, cycles of abuse within a family, the inner child. We hear a lot about the inner child. So, in that particular section, just give us kind of an overview of what you wanted us to really be able to grasp about that there are different levels to what it is we might be dealing with.
Yeah, my hope was for us to like kind of zoom out, right? And like really get a sense of what are all the moving pieces that all contribute to the fact that we're suffering in this way. Because oftentimes, when we're talking about trauma, or even like if any of us think about maybe our first couple sessions in therapy, if we've been to it, typically we're like, this is happening in my life and this is happening and this is happening. And it's very, focused on the things that feel like they need to come out and are hurting. But oftentimes we don't take an opportunity, and this is because we just haven't been trained to do so. We don't take an opportunity to really understand all the things that are impacting us. An example is right now, there are a lot of Black and Brown folks who are experiencing the emotional repercussions of the diversity and equity and
Mm,
inclusion practices being cut from corporations, and the ways in which there's a resurfacing of a lot of anti-Black and anti person of color or BIPOC person like sentiments that are kind of creating a bit more of that anxiety that we know collectively is there. We're like, what is likely to happen? We know what's likely to happen.
right.
There's a lot of people that are being laid off that have inclusion efforts within their organizations. Corporations are cutting, educational institutions are cutting these efforts. I, as a person that I'm about to go on college tours with my nephew, and we want to look at Florida because he wants to go to school in Florida, but I am concerned about how will he, as a very, very visible Black presenting boy, how will he have his identities affirmed in an institution that is not willing to recognize the uniqueness of his experiences as a Black child? And so it's
Right.
like, these are things that are in the air, but we're so used to it, we're not really realizing this is a part of the layers. We are also experiencing collective traumas. We are also experiencing, not just the abuse and invalidations that can happen in our family line, but also the ones that happen systemically. We're being
Mhm.
constantly abused by the systems that we have to live under. We're being constantly invalidated by these institutions and gaslit by them. So how is it that that also is a layer of how intergenerational trauma shows up in our daily lives? And how can we start bringing in a lot of the layers so that we can have a full scope of what's hurting and what's contributing to the hurt?
Hmm. And as you were saying that on the tail end of it, I'm thinking of how those kinds of things can show up, in our families, in different things like that. Where if you have, say, for example, society out here is telling you that things need to be a certain way, and maybe the person that is the parent is trying to go along with what society is telling you, but that's not really how you want to function, how that can create problems in a
Yeah.
family. Or, I think of, nowadays we live in a time where people have a bit more, I'm going to say, freedom to identify in the way that they want to, or they choose to, or that they believe, for themselves. But then you still have people who will try to squash that down.
Mhm.
Even though society might be saying it's okay in some cases it's not. All of those things play a factor in how, we're dealing within our families and within our closer relationships.
Yes, it's such an important point, right? Because our families are basically like a replica of society, right? Like, we don't just exist in a silo. We exist in families that are influenced by external forces in whatever ways, whether it's our ideas, our ideologies, our perspectives that we're bringing into our family homes that create an invalidation that's identity based. Or it could be that, because our families, we may have an auntie that has to take the train and she takes 3 trains. And in one of them, somebody like aggresses her for the color of her skin or for her phenotype that's presenting Black, right? And she experiences that, but then, on the way walking towards the house, she, like, somebody says something that's really coming out of their face. And so she's bringing in all of those experiences that have a collective element because they're about systemic ideas that have been ingrained in our society. She's bringing that into now the interaction that she has with someone who's telling her, like, aren't you going to be the one to cook tonight? And now she blows up. But the reason, she's carrying 3 trains worth of, stress. And so when we're talking about the layers and bringing in the layers, we're also talking about what are the important factors of a person's life that we can look at generationally that contributes to how they show up in a wounded way. And it's why I decided to develop my own version of the of the ACEs questionnaire, which is an intergenerational one, because it asks the question, what happened to you? Important. But also, what happened before you? Like, what happened to older generations that are also a part of your wound experience? And in addition to that, what happened around you? Were you like someone that, was in a corporation that now had those cuts and you now had to, like, sit in the tension of that, right? Were you somebody that suffered disproportionately so because of the communities you belong to, an even harder pandemic than maybe somebody that had a different experience because of their identities? And so, like, all of that is also what happened around you. So we start asking the question, not just what happened to you, but what happened to you through the generations, all inclusive.
I took the test that you have online,
Mhm.
and I don't know what the numbers mean, but I had like 11 out of 43, which was like
Mhm.
25.6%.
Mhm.
So I did take it, which is like, what happened before you, what happened to you, and what happened around you. So I would assume that the higher those numbers are, the more, stress or more impact all of these factors would have on a person's psyche. I'm going to guess.
Absolutely, yes. And I'm still working out, because I'm conducting research around that questionnaire. Um, what those numbers entirely mean. What I am finding in the preliminary research that has been conducted already, that there is a direct connection to the ways in which we have experienced hurt and pain to the ways that our parents and people before us have experienced hurt and pain. So there's a direct connection. And the reason why I wanted to put that questionnaire online for people to, at the very least, answer the questions, even if we still are kind of wrapping our heads around what the numbers mean, is because one, I wanted us to have a conversation starter and to be able to say, hey, look, I didn't even consider that. This could be like, I had actually a parent that was incarcerated, but in my generation, I also had a 1-day stint in a facility, and that's an intergenerational wound that we both feared that we might be, indoctrinated into this very violent system that is a prison industrial complex. And so like we're looking at the fact that there's a generational tie. And what I do know from previous studies that other people have conducted is that there are some understandings that we have that if a parent or grandparent or someone beyond them has actually suffered, especially a childhood adversity, their children are more likely to actually suffer the very same adversities or additional adversities. And so we know that when we talk about childhood adversity, it's not just in our generation. For the most part, we're talking about parents that maybe inflicted abuse by way of, grabbing a belt or another item because that's what they learned, because they were also hurt that way, because it was passed on as culture and identified as just the thing that parents do to get their children in line, because that's something that they learned from the multiple decades and centuries in which we were people that had been enslaved and placed in line through very similar mechanisms. And so when we start looking at the through line, we start realizing it gets heavy, right? It gets really heavy, but it also, the heaviness, I think, is in part important for us to acknowledge this is where the pain comes from. And it also drives a conviction for a lot of people to say, and it ends with me.
Right. Because once again, it's about breaking the cycle.
Mm-hmm.
And believe it or not, in our last few minutes, we're going to talk a little bit about that, because the last section of the book talks about alchemizing your legacy, which is a lot of, doing the work that we have in the earlier chapters. And, there's a space where you have like a trauma tree, which is kind of like a family tree where you go in and kind of determine based on the people that you can touch, that you're aware of things that happen to them and how, it impacts who you are. But, after doing all of that work and sorting through all of that work, getting to a space of saying, okay, I'm breaking this cycle, whatever those cycles are, and I want to do something different. And one of the first things, it talks about grief again, but grief in a different way, how you have to grieve your traumatic lineage, and maybe, well, I'll let you tell it. Grieve the family that you have versus the family that you wanted.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. A lot of us have actually like held on to this idea of the families that we wish we had and the people that they could have been if they had actually done the work. And I think that that's a common experience for a lot of cycle breakers that actually creates more anger and rage. And it's understandable to have those emotions, but they can be actually very limiting in the process. What we need is an active process of grief. We need to grieve the fact that we didn't have the parents that knew to not grab the belt. We need to grieve the fact that we had, grandparents that continued to yell because they learned that in order to, get their point across, that's what you do. And what that did is that it created wounds in us, right? But we need to grieve that aspect of our family and then step into what I call our true family, which is the family that we indeed have in front of us. It's the family that we have with the flaws, with the unhealed wounds, with the inability to really, step into the courage of healing. And that's the family that's in front of us. And even as a person that's a fellow cycle breaker, I get confronted with that all the time. My parents, as I mentioned, have done some work, and I'm really proud of them. But there are moments when I'm like, I just have to shake my head, like, they have their limitations, and I have to
Right.
honor. I have to honor that in, generations that were 70, 80, 90 years, kind of removed from my own, that people dealt with issues by avoiding them. Shh, we don't talk about that, right?
Right.
We just put it in the closet of family secrets. And that it's I have to honor the fact that the parents that I have are parents that are doing even tiny, tiny pieces of work to be able to be better, while also holding on to what feels like more antiquated ways of being that hurt them and could hurt me too. And that's my true family. That's the family that's in front of me. That's the real family that I have without me creating a fantasy of who they could have been. And what I
Mm-hmm.
find that helps with, and I took this concept a little bit, I tweaked it from one of the former therapies that are like cognitive behavioral, which there's this concept called radical acceptance. And
Mm-hmm.
radical acceptance is radically accepting the truth of what is right now. And as we do that, what has been found with radical acceptance is that it decreases our suffering. And I thought, well, what about a process of grief with relation to family? If we
Mm-hmm.
grieve the family that we wish we had, and we just step into a radical acceptance of the true family that's in front of us, that helps to decrease our suffering from having to like kind of push and push and push. No, you must be this way. You must change. You must break the cycle too, right? And that creates just added suffering and tension in our lives versus this is the family that I have and the radical acceptance around that, which definitely helps us to feel more settled.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, there's so many other things that you talk about in there. I could talk to you for 2 hours or more about this book.
Same.
Just things like, a lot of times that that how can I put it? Like this intergenerational loyalty that
Mm,
people have, like, oh, you just have to be loyal and all of this stuff, regardless of what's happening around you, you're loyal. But sometimes, yeah, I mean, just a lot of things like that, to have or not to have some of those conversations with people, because there's some people that you might try to go to and talk to about your thoughts, your feelings about the relationship, and they won't be receptive,
mhm.
dealing with all of that. So I appreciate that you tap into that in the book and, understand that those are sometimes the tough parts of this whole thing, to
Mhm.
get to where you know that you need to be.
Yeah. It is tough, and I made sure not to take away from that. So thank you for acknowledging that too, because I don't want to like sit here and be in this fluffy space of like, and things are amazing because, actually they don't feel very good for the moment. They it's almost like growing pains. Like we
Mhm.
feel the pain of that growth, but there is intergenerational post-traumatic growth that happens beyond the generational trauma, indeed. But to get through it, we have to get through it. And hurdles oftentimes don't feel good. They feel like tension building, and they feel like we have to go through a process of really difficult conversations. We have to go through a process of sitting with the loneliness that can come from breaking cycles, which does not feel great,
Mhm.
and a host of other things that come up, right? And so all of that is a part of the journey, yes, which is why a lot of people say, I don't want to break the cycle because it hurts too much.
Right.
But what I do want to have us recognize is that, you know, some of us have been on this earth 3, 4, 5 decades, right? Maybe more. And we've lived in pain for all that time.
Mm.
And if we look at our lives and we look at the extent of what we could live, do we want to live 3, 4, 5 decades more in pain? Or do we
Right.
want to put in the hard work now to feel the lightness and the softness that's sustainable and live another 40, 50 years that are actually reflective of the cycle breaking work, the hard work that we were willing to do?
Absolutely. I love it. Last but not least, might take 5 extra minutes from you. Thinking about the future, because the whole thing is to break a cycle, and then those that come behind us
Hmm.
can have a different view of what life can and should be for themselves and the future generations. So you do talk about that as well, like learning how to parent, with the future generations, and even sometimes reparenting our own selves.
Mhm. Yeah. No, I know. And the reparenting that happens simultaneously to parenting, which like I say, it's, double the work and double the reward, right? But for us, it's important. I've always seen our communities as communities that are very driven by how we can impact the future generations. That's ingrained in us. We have this care for the future. It's just, it's how we are. We're very communal people. We care about the collective. We care about the upcoming generations. So that's already easy because it's baked into us. So that was the easier part of my job, to then inculcate in the protocol of break the cycle legacy building. Okay, so how do we build legacies in the ways that we parent, right? How is it that the ways that you show up and how you apologize to your child is a part of how you build a legacy because you never got apologized to? How is that going to be different in how they then can internalize the idea, I am worthy of an apology? My mother apologizes to me and says, I'm sorry when she errs. She models that for me, but also tells me that I am somebody who has value and enough
Mhm.
value to say I'm sorry to. So, how is that a part of the legacy that you're creating and building and transferring forward versus the legacy of being so ashamed with how you behaved with your child that you like brush it under the rug and never mention it again?
Right.
Right? It's a very different legacy. So, it's, that part of how the work continues beyond us is a really important aspect too.
Yes, yes, and I love it. I love it all. I told you that I'm smiling. I told you I'm going to get into it again and actually do the exercises, because it's always important for me to read to make sure that we can have such wonderful conversations, such as the one we're having now. But I really thank you again for doing this work, and I really pray that will either get the audio, because you get to hear your voice on the audio. Either get the audio and listen to it and rewind and save it and pause it and do the exercises, or
Mhm.
or to get the physical book and be able to mark things down and all of that. So in terms of things that you might have coming up, or places where people can either see you in person or other events, is there anything that's coming up soon that people can tap into?
Uh, Yeah, I think there's I try to make a good concerted effort of like making sure my social media is up to date with some places that I'll be showing up in. So there's a few events, some in New York, some that a little bit more in other places. But I think that if people stay tuned, like on my website and particularly on LinkedIn and sometimes on Instagram, I tend to have like more of the updates there. And if it's local and they can make the time, then I'd love to meet folks. I'm a hugger, so I always tell people, if you meet me in person, and if you're open to it, definitely lean in for a hug and
All
let's
right.
take
I'll keep
a
that in
conversation.
mind. You come to Atlanta.
Oh yes, I'll keep you in mind if I go to Atlanta because I'm gonna keep you honest on my hug.
Right. Come
Yeah.
Oh, wow. And I also would suggest that everyone go to the website and sign up for the mailing list, because there's things that you send out through there as well. So, and the resources, there's some sound baths there, as well as that intergenerational adverse experiences questionnaire is there as well under the resources. So I would suggest you do all that if you just want to dip your toe in and see what it's all about, and then get the book and do the hard work.
Yeah.
Um, so thank you so much. I do appreciate you for being here. I appreciate everyone for watching, those who are watching live, as well as those who will catch this in the replay. I really do suggest that you go out and grab a copy of the book at your favorite bookseller or Brown Girl Collective Bookstore, which is affiliated with Bookshop. You can go there at browngirlcollectivebookstore.com. You will see the book highlighted there as well. So Thank you all for your time. And I want you to hang on for just a second, Dr. Buqué, but I'm going to let everybody else go. So good night to everyone. And we look forward to seeing you again real soon. Next week, we'll be back with another special guest. Next week, we're going to be talking about work and workplace and how we show up in that space. So looking forward to that as well. So we will see you then. And until then, take good care. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.